She sat at that dinner table for the last time without knowing it, 62 years old, recently unemployed, wearing a smile that cost her everything to hold together, and in front of her own son, in front of people she'd fed, supported, and quietly saved more times than she could count. Her daughter-in-law looked her dead in the eyes and called her a loser, not a whisper, not a slip, a declaration, and nobody moved. If you've ever been humiliated by someone you helped build up, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far the story travels. The woman who kept her mouth shut until she couldn't anymore. The table looked beautiful, and that made it worse somehow. There were candles, real ones, not the cheap tea light kind, arranged in the center of the dining room table. My son Derek had bought 3 years ago with money I quietly handed him without once asking for a receipt. The wine glasses were crystal. The napkins were folded into something that looked like swans, which I privately thought was ridiculous for a Sunday dinner, but I had learned years ago to keep that kind of opinion to myself. I am Marina Cole. I was 62 years old at the time all of this happened. I am not a woman who complains easily. I was raised in a house where you showed up. You worked. You did not make your pain someone else's problem. My mother used to say, carry your weight and then some, because someone will always be watching to see if you buckle. I carried that with me for 6 decades. I thought it made me strong. I didn't understand yet that other people had learned to read my silence as permission. That Sunday in October, I drove 40 minutes to Derek and Vanessa's house in Clover Ridge, a neighborhood that always felt slightly too expensive and slightly too proud of itself. The kind of subdivision where people put up seasonal wreaths before the season actually changes, just to make sure the neighbors notice. Vanessa loved it there. She loved being seen. I brought a casserole. I brought a bottle of red wine that was better than anything on their table. And I brought the quiet, careful version of myself that I always brought to family gatherings. The version that laughed at the right moments, deflected tension before it could ignite, and watched everything without letting on that I was watching. My son, Derek, was already in the kitchen when I arrived, nursing what looked like his second glass of something. He kissed my cheek and said, "Hey Mom, glad you made it," in the same distracted way he said most things these days, like his mind was already in the next room. He used to call me on Tuesday evenings just to talk. That had stopped somewhere around the time Vanessa redecorated the living room and decided she preferred their social calendar managed without outside input. Her words, not mine. Vanessa herself appeared from the hallway like a woman entering a room she owned, which technically she did, though technically the down payment was a complicated story I won't get into yet. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse that probably cost more than my monthly utilities. Her hair was blown out. Her nails were done. She smiled at me in the way people smile when they're deciding something about you. Marina, not Mom. Never Mom. You're here. I am, I said, and held up the casserole. I made the chicken thing Derek likes. He's been watching his sodium, she said, and turned back toward the living room. I set the casserole on the counter and breathed. The others arrived within the hour. Derek's aunt, Patricia, who was my late husband's sister and who loved me genuinely, but expressed it mostly through sad, searching looks. My nephew Caleb and his girlfriend Tess, both in their late 20s and visibly uncomfortable at family gatherings, but present because family obligation is the tax no one signs up for. And Vanessa's younger brother, Marcus, who lived 20 minutes away and came to every dinner uninvited and ate more than anyone in the room and laughed too loudly at his own observations. We gathered around the table. Vanessa had set like a magazine photo spread. She poured the wine, not mine, hers, something she described as a really gorgeous natural wine that tasted to me like fruit left in a warm car, and the dinner began. For a while, it was fine in the way that family dinners often are, a careful, slightly airless performance of normalcy, where everyone speaks about things that don't matter and avoids the things that do. Caleb talked about a road trip he and Tess were planning. Patricia asked questions about Derek's work. Marcus talked about himself at length and with great enthusiasm. Vanessa refilled her own glass frequently and smiled at things people said without really listening. I ate quietly. I asked questions. I laughed when it was appropriate. I was doing what I had always done. I was managing the temperature of the room, keeping things even, making sure nobody got too cold. I didn't know I was doing it. That was the thing. I had been doing it for so long that it had stopped feeling like effort and started feeling like just being me. And then the subject of work came up, not in any dramatic way. Caleb mentioned something about the job market, how a friend of his had been laid off recently and struggling to find something in the same field. Patricia made a sympathetic sound. Tess said something about how hard it was out there right now, even for people with a lot of experience. I didn't offer anything. I didn't bring attention to myself because, yes, I had been laid off 3 months earlier from a project management position I'd held for 11 years. A restructure, budget cuts, the kind of ending that isn't personal but feels personal in the bones of you, in the way you stand in the shower for too long in the morning, trying to figure out what you are now, if you're not the thing you were. I had not told everyone at the table. Derek knew that was enough, or I thought it was enough. Vanessa set down her wine glass with a small, deliberate sound and looked at me from across the table. Marina, she said in the pleasant conversational tone she used when she was doing something unpleasant, I keep meaning to ask, are you still unemployed? The word landed in the room like a stone into still water. I watched the ripples move across people's faces. Caleb looked down at his plate. Tess went very still. Patricia's hand tightened around her fork. I'm between positions, yes, I said, calm, measured. I was good at that. Vanessa tilted her head. How long has it been now? 3 months, 4? About 3 months. She picked up her glass again, swirled it. That's a long time at your age. It must be really difficult. Companies are so focused on younger candidates these days. There it was, at your age, a little needle inserted precisely. It's a competitive market, I agreed. I just wonder, Vanessa continued, and I could feel the room start to hold its breath, could feel Derek's posture change beside me without even looking at him. I just wonder what the plan is, because she laughed briefly, a little performance of light amusement. It's not like you have a lot of time left to start over, right? Like, realistically. The table was quiet. I looked at her. She looked at me. I have a plan, I said. Good, she smiled. Because you don't want to end up... She paused, seeming to search for the word with a theatricality that suggested she'd already found it. Desperate. That's such an ugly place to be, especially when you've had people carrying you for so long already. Carrying me. The phrase went through me like cold water. Vanessa, Derek said very quietly. I'm just being honest, she said, waving her hand. Marina, I say this because I care. Let's be real. You've had a lot of help from this family over the years, Derek especially. And it's wonderful that we could be there for you. But there has to come a point where you take responsibility for building your own stability. You know? I heard Patricia make a small sound. I did not look at her. I was looking at Vanessa, who had just told a room full of people that I had been carried by my son, that I had been a burden dressed as a mother, that my unemployment was a symptom of some deeper failure of character and ambition and grit, that she had apparently been observing and cataloguing for years. I felt something rise in my chest, something old and hot and very, very tired. But I looked down at my plate, and I cut a small piece of chicken, and I put it in my mouth and chewed slowly and set my fork down and folded my hands in my lap. And I said nothing, because that's what I always did. I carried the heat inside where nobody could see it, and I smiled and I survived. Marcus laughed at something that wasn't funny. The conversation moved. Vanessa refilled her glass. Derek stared at the tablecloth, like it contained an answer to a question he couldn't quite form. But something had changed in me at that moment, sitting at that beautiful table with the swan-folded napkins and the natural wine and the candles burning down. Something had shifted, deep, tectonic, below the level of words, and I wouldn't fully understand what it was until several days later. What Vanessa didn't know, what nobody at that table seemed to know or had allowed themselves to remember, was who exactly had been carrying whom. Let me tell you something about the year everything nearly collapsed. Derek was 31. He had a new business, a small logistics consulting firm he'd started with a partner named Glenn, who turned out to be charming and unreliable in roughly equal measure. The business was burning through money. Derek was drowning in a way he didn't know how to admit, especially to Vanessa, whom he'd been dating for 8 months and was already half afraid of disappointing. He came to me on a Wednesday, sat in my kitchen, a different kitchen in my condo on Elm Street, and put his head down on the table like he was 12 again and had failed a test. "I'm going to lose everything, Mom," he said. "The business is hemorrhaging. Glenn's been pulling cash out and I didn't catch it in time. I have creditors calling. I don't know what to do." I made coffee. I listened for 2 hours. And then I went to my filing cabinet and I pulled out documents he'd never seen, and I made decisions he didn't know I was making. I had savings. Not a fortune, but real money. Money I'd been putting away for 15 years steadily, carefully, the way you build something when nobody's watching and nobody's clapping. I had a retirement account I wasn't supposed to touch. I had a half interest in a property that had appreciated quietly in a part of the city people were only just starting to pay attention to. I liquidated a portion. I took a penalty on the retirement fund that still makes me flinch to think about. I co-signed a business loan that meant my name was attached to Derek's debt in ways that would affect my credit for years. I structured a private financial agreement through my attorney that stabilized his business while keeping Glenn out and creating a legal firewall that protected what Derek had built from further exposure. I did not tell him everything I did. Parents don't always. Some things you do not make a production of. You simply do them, because the alternative is watching someone you love go under, and you cannot do that. You cannot stand there and watch. Derek's firm didn't fail. It steadied slowly and then it grew. He bought out Glenn's interest. He hired good people. He relocated to Clover Ridge with Vanessa, who by then had become his wife in a wedding I helped fund through a gift that I told no one the real size of. And Vanessa, who had met Derek after the crisis, who had entered his life when the storm had already passed, and the sun was coming out and everything looked stable and promising. Vanessa never knew what the ground beneath her feet had cost. She thought Derek had built it himself. He let her think that. Maybe he'd convinced himself by then. Memory is a comfortable liar. I drove home from that dinner in Clover Ridge with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The night was clear. The highway was nearly empty, and I let myself feel, for the first time in those 40 minutes of road, what had actually happened at that table. I had been publicly humiliated by a woman who slept in a house that existed because of me. I had been called a burden by someone whose financial security I had indirectly built. I had been mocked as a failure, a loser, the word she would use 3 days later to a relative on the phone without realizing I could hear her through the wall. "Honestly, Patricia, Marina is just such a loser. She's always needed someone to prop her up." By a person who did not know what I knew, who did not know what I held, who had looked at my stillness and mistaken it for emptiness. I pulled into my parking spot. I sat in the car for a moment. I am not a dramatic woman. I don't like scenes. I've spent my whole life trying not to make things worse, and a lot of that impulse is genuine. I actually don't enjoy conflict. I actually do believe that most problems can be absorbed by the person willing to be patient enough. My mother wasn't wrong about that, but there is a difference between patience and erasure. And what Vanessa had done at that dinner table was not just an insult. It was an attempt at erasure, at writing me out of the story of what I had contributed, at reducing me to a liability instead of acknowledging that I was the very foundation she'd been standing on without knowing it. I sat in the car for another minute. Then I went inside, made tea, and opened the drawer where I kept my old files. There is a specific kind of quiet that comes over you when you've made a decision. Not the anxious quiet of indecision that has a hum to it, a vibration of unease. This was different. This was the quiet of a woman who had finished something internal, who had done the arguing with herself in the car and arrived somewhere solid. I sat at my kitchen table with my tea cooling beside me, and I pulled out folders I hadn't opened in years, the loan co-signature documents, the financial agreement between Derek's firm and the private funding arrangement I'd structured through my attorney, The property deeds, including one that most of the family didn't know existed in any detailed way, a commercial property in the Milford district that had been in my name for a decade and whose current value was significantly higher than anyone in Derek's household would have guessed. The original paperwork from the agreement that had saved Derek's business, with every clause intact, including the repayment structure that Derek had signed and that had never been formally closed out, a loose thread that I had been too gracious to pull. I went through everything slowly. I read the language. I made notes in the margins of a yellow legal pad in my own handwriting, the way I used to do in meetings when I was still employed and people expected things of me. The numbers were clear. The obligations were clear. And for the first time in a very long time, I allowed myself to think clearly about what I was owed, not emotionally, not in terms of gratitude or love or any of the soft, bruisable things that families run on, but legally, factually, on paper. I was owed quite a lot. I did not pick up my phone. I did not call Derek. I did not call Vanessa and say anything at all. I just sat with the documents and the cooling tea and the quiet of my apartment, and I felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I could calculate. I felt dangerous, not in a violent way, not in a vindictive way exactly, just dangerous in the way that a very still, very patient thing becomes dangerous when it finally decides to move. Big. Patricia called me the next morning. "Marina," she said without preamble, "that was not okay." "No," I agreed, "it wasn't. Derek should have said something. He just sat there." She paused. "I'm so sorry. That woman is—" I heard her searching for the right word and choosing a diplomatic one. "She's a lot." "She is," I said. "Are you all right?" I thought about it honestly for a moment, in a way I often didn't when people asked. "I'm figuring some things out," I said. Patricia was quiet for a beat. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm going to be fine," I said, "just maybe differently fine than I've been up until now." She didn't entirely understand that, but she said okay, and she told me she loved me, and we hung up. I poured the rest of my cold tea into the sink and made fresh. What nobody at that dinner had considered, what Vanessa in particular had never stopped to consider in all her confidence and social calculation, was the architecture of what held their life together. She knew Derek ran a successful firm. She knew they lived well. She knew the house was comfortable and the vacations were nice and the account balances were healthy. She attributed all of this, as far as I could tell, to Derek's business acumen and to her own management of their social and domestic life, which she was genuinely good at. Vanessa was not stupid. She was sharp, actually. She just had the particular blindness of someone who had always arrived after the work was done. She had never asked where the initial stability came from. She had never asked about the early years of the firm, about how Derek had survived his first real crisis, about what name appeared on certain loan documents. She had simply moved into the life that existed and claimed it as the natural result of the people she and Derek were. And Derek, my Derek, who I had held as a baby, who had called me crying the night his first business deal fell through, who had sat in my kitchen and put his head down on my table. Derek had not corrected her. I don't know exactly when he stopped correcting her. I don't know if it was a decision or a drift. People drift away from gratitude the way they drift away from a lot of things. Not in any dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small choices to look forward instead of back, to accept the credit that comes to you and not spend too much time on the question of where it originated. I was my son. I had not raised him to be this, but he had become something I needed to look at clearly, and that looking was the most painful part. Not Vanessa's cruelty, that was just cruelty. It had a shape, it had a name, it could be dealt with. Derek's silence was the thing that had no shape. Derek's silence at that dinner table while his wife called me a burden, a failure, a woman who'd needed to be carried. That silence was the wound that didn't bleed visibly, but went deeper than anything Vanessa had said. I sat with that wound for 2 days. I sat with it in the morning and at night. I let it be real. And then I picked up the phone and called my attorney. Her name was Helen Marsh, and she had been my attorney for 14 years. She was in her mid-50s, meticulous, and had the particular quality of being entirely unsurprised by human behavior, which I found comforting. I need to review some old agreements, I told her, some documents that were never formally closed. When can you come in? She said. I came in the following Thursday. I sat across from Helen in her quiet office and I laid out everything I'd spent the previous days going through. And she read and she made notes and she pulled up things on her computer and she was quiet for a long time. Then she looked at me over her reading glasses. Marina, she said, you have been very patient. I know, I said, and now? I looked at her, and now I need to know exactly where I stand. And I need to make sure that certain people understand it too. Helen nodded slowly. She turned back to the document. Give me 2 weeks, she said. I want to look at everything. I thanked her and left. On the drive home, for the first time in months, I felt like myself. Not the self who managed everyone else's comfort, not the self who absorbed damage and smiled through it. The self who had built things quietly in the dark, who had kept records when nobody else thought records mattered, who had protected people who were not currently protecting her, and who had finally decided that the protection could be redirected. The radio was on. The October light was doing something extraordinary with the trees on either side of the highway, all that burning gold and copper, all that gorgeous impending change. I was 62 years old. I had been called a loser by a woman whose security I had funded. I drove home through the burning trees, and I thought, not for much longer. Sante, there's one more thing I want to tell you about that dinner. Something small that I've thought about many times since. When I got up to leave the table that night, when I folded my napkin, the ridiculous swan, and set it beside my plate and said I was a little tired, and it had been a lovely evening, Vanessa looked at me with an expression I can only describe as satisfaction. Like she had accomplished something. Like she had tested a boundary and found no resistance and filed that away for future use. She walked me to the door. She said, drive safe in the warm, empty way people say things they don't mean. And she closed the door behind me before I'd even reached my car. I sat in the driveway for a moment. The light was on inside. I could see through the living room window, Vanessa returning to the table, laughing at something Marcus said, Derek refilling his glass, the party continuing without me as though I'd been an interruption that had finally resolved itself. There is a specific kind of grief that comes from watching people you love fail you while you watch from the outside through glass. It doesn't announce itself. It settles. It becomes part of the furniture of you, part of how you carry yourself, part of the posture you develop for the world. I had been grieving quietly for a long time, I understood, sitting in that driveway. I didn't know yet that grief, when it runs its course, eventually becomes something else entirely. I started the car. I pulled out of the driveway, and I went home to open the drawer. Helen called me on a Friday afternoon, 11 days after our meeting. I was in the middle of reheating soup, the mundane, slightly depressing kind of lunch you make when you're between jobs and the days have stopped having edges. When my phone buzzed on the counter and her name appeared on the screen, I turned off the stove. I sat down before I answered because something in me already knew this was not a casual call. Marina, she said, I've been through everything, all of it, and I need you to sit down. I'm sitting, I told her. There was a brief pause on her end, the kind a person takes when they're choosing their words carefully, not because they're bad at words, but because the words are heavy. Do you understand, Helen said slowly, the full scope of what you did for Derek in 2014? I think so, I said. I was there. I don't think you've looked at it from a distance in a long time, she said. So let me tell you what I see, because what I see is significant. She walked me through it, the loan co-signature, which had never been formally discharged from my name, which still existed as a legal instrument with my signature on it, which meant my credit and my liability had been attached to Derek's business for almost a decade without anyone thinking to clean it up. The private funding agreement, which included a repayment clause that Derek had signed and that had never been honored, not a single payment, not a formal renegotiation, not even an acknowledgement that it still existed. The property arrangement more complicated than I'll get into here, but the short version is that the Milford District commercial property had appreciated to a value that was, by Helen's conservative estimate, about 4 times what anyone in Derek's household would have assumed. And there was something else. Something Helen had found by going back through the original business documents that I hadn't thought about in years. When you helped Derek restructure after the Glen situation, she said, you didn't just co-sign and write a check, you took an equity position. I was quiet. A small one, she continued, 14%. It was in the restructuring agreement. It was never bought out. It was never dissolved. Derek's firm has grown considerably since 2014 Marina. 14% of what that business is worth today is not a small number. I sat at my kitchen table with the cold soup in its pot on the stove, and I looked at the wall and I breathed. He never mentioned it, I said. Not an accusation, just a fact, spoken aloud. No, Helen said, he didn't. And the question is whether he forgot or whether he chose not to remember. Either way, it doesn't change the paperwork. We talked for another hour. I did not cry, which surprised me a little. I had done most of my crying in the quiet of the previous 2 weeks. In the space between waking and getting up in the morning, in the shower, once in my car outside a grocery store for reasons that seemed both obvious and embarrassing. By the time Helen called, I had run out of tears for the situation and graduated into something colder and more functional. When we hung up, I sat at the table for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and looked at Derek's contact information. His name, the photo I had of him that was 4 years old, the last 3 texts between us, which were all logistical and brief. I put the phone back down. Not yet, I told myself, not without knowing exactly what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it. That was the discipline my mother had given me that Vanessa had never understood. Silence is not the absence of something. Silence is the presence of patience. And patience in the right hands is the sharpest tool in the room. The humiliation didn't stay at the dinner table. That was the thing about Vanessa. She wasn't the kind of person who said something cruel and then let it rest. She was the kind of person who, having tested the fence and found it without voltage, went back to test it again. Patricia called me 6 days after the dinner to tell me something she'd heard through the extended family network that I can only describe as the Cole family telephone line, which was old and reliable and frequently devastating. She's been talking, Patricia said. Her voice had the careful, apologetic quality of someone delivering bad news they didn't ask to carry. About, I said, though I already knew. About you, about the job situation. She told your cousin Bea that you've been... Patricia paused. I could hear her bracing. She said you've been living on Derek's goodwill for years, her words. I closed my eyes briefly. What else? She told Marcus, this is what Marcus told Caleb who called me. She said you were a cautionary tale about what happens when women don't plan their futures. Marina, I'm so sorry. She's making it a whole. She's telling people. I know, I said. You're not upset? I thought about how to answer that honestly. I'm past upset, I said. I'm in a different place now. Patricia didn't know what to do with that, but she said she loved me and we said goodbye, and I put the phone down and made a note on my legal pad. Because I was keeping notes now, not out of obsession, I want to be clear about that because there's a version of the story where the woman wronged becomes a woman consumed, and that was not what was happening to me. I was keeping notes because I had spent my entire adult life being meticulous in every professional context and casual about my personal interests, and I had decided it was time to reverse that. Every conversation that had been reported to me, every name Vanessa had apparently spoken my name to, every claim she'd made about my dependence, my failure, my status in this family, I wrote it down, not in anger, in the way you document something that may one day need to be accounted for. What I didn't anticipate was Derek. I had expected Vanessa to escalate. That was consistent with everything I'd observed about her in 4 years of watching her operate. What I had not fully prepared for was my son's participation. Not through cruelty, but through that same terrible silence, now extended into active avoidance. Han didn't call. In the 18 days between the dinner and the meeting I was quietly preparing for, Derek called me once, and it was to ask if I still had a copy of a tax document from 2017 that his accountant needed, and the conversation lasted 6 minutes, and he did not mention the dinner, and he did not apologize, and he did not ask how I was. 6 minutes. Tax documents. Goodbye. I stood in my kitchen after that call, and I did something I don't do very often. I sat with the full weight of it. I did not rush to explain it away or soften it or find the charitable interpretation. I let it be exactly as bad as it was. My son had watched his wife publicly humiliate me and had said nothing. And now, more than 2 weeks later, he had called me about paperwork. This was not the Derek I had raised, but he was still the Derek I had, and I had a decision to make about what that meant going forward. Not in terms of whether I loved him, because that was not a question that had an off switch. I had learned that much from being a mother. But in terms of what I was willing to absorb in the name of that love, and what I was no longer going to pretend was acceptable. The line is different for every person. I had not known where mine was until Vanessa helped me find it. Caleb came to see me on a Wednesday. He showed up unannounced, which was not like him, and when I opened the door and saw his face, he looked like he hadn't slept, and he was holding a paper bag from the bakery on 5th that used to be near my old office, the kind of thing you bring when you don't know what else to do. I felt a complicated wash of affection and dread. I brought scones, he said, the lemon ones you like. Come in, I said. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd been going through my documents, and I put the kettle on and he unwrapped the scones, and for a while we just did that, occupied ourselves with the small logistics of tea and food, and not the thing we were both thinking about. Then Caleb said, I've been hearing things. I imagine so, I said. Marina, he stopped. He called me Marina, not Aunt Marina, which was something he'd started doing around the time he turned 25. And I told him he was too old for the aunt, just call me Marina. I'd liked it then. It felt different now, less familial distance, more directness. She's not stopping. Whatever she said at dinner, she didn't just let it go. She's telling people things about you that are not fair, and some people are listening. Which people? I said, unhesitated. B's husband, a couple of people from Derek's side that I don't know well. She's framing it like he struggled for a moment. Concerned about you, like she's the one worried about you going off the rails in your old age. She makes it sound caring, and it's not caring at all. I poured the tea. I set his mug in front of him. Caleb, I said, do you want to know what's actually going on, or do you want to feel better about the situation? He looked at me for a moment. Both, he said honestly, but I'll take whichever one you can give me. I appreciated that he was 28 and didn't pretend to have it figured out. There was something genuinely decent about Caleb that I had always recognized, and that the rest of the family sometimes overlooked, because he was quiet and didn't have Derek's business accomplishments or Vanessa's social fluency. I'm handling it, I said. Handling it how? In a way that's going to require some patience, I said, from people who trust me. He wrapped his hands around his mug. Do I need to do anything? Just don't repeat things to Derek right now, I said. Can you do that? He nodded slowly. He didn't ask why, which told me he'd already thought about it and arrived at a reasonable guess. We ate the scones. They were good. The lemon ones always were. We talked about other things, lighter things, his road trip plans with Tess, a book he'd been reading, a funny thing that had happened at his job. It was the most normal hour I'd had in weeks. And when he left and I closed the door behind him, I stood in the hallway for a moment and felt something that was very close to gratitude. Not everyone had disappeared into the Vanessa version of events. There were still people in this family who were capable of showing up with scones and sitting at my kitchen table and treating me like a person instead of a cautionary tale. That mattered. I let it matter. It was 3 days after Caleb's visit that I overheard the phone call. I was not snooping. That is important to me, and it's important to the story, because the way things are revealed says something about the shape of the truth. I was not at Derek and Vanessa's house. I was at Patricia's. Patricia had invited me for coffee, and Vanessa had apparently not anticipated that Patricia and I had the kind of relationship that included spontaneous coffees, because when Vanessa called Patricia's home line that afternoon, and Patricia handed me the mug, and stepped into the kitchen to answer. She left the kitchen door open, and the house was small, and the walls were thin, and I heard everything. I wasn't trying to. And then I was, because the first words I caught were my name. Marina is just Vanessa's voice coming through the kitchen wall, carrying the cheerful authority she wore like a second outfit. She's always been this way, Patricia. She floats. She always has. Derek loves her, obviously, but he spent his whole adult life catching her when she stumbles, and I think he's just exhausted, honestly. He would never say that to her, but I can see it. She drains him. I sat very still. The mug was warm in my hands. She's got no real plan, Vanessa continued. No real savings. No real prospects. At her age, Patricia, what is she going to do? She needs to be realistic. I'm not trying to be harsh. I'm trying to be honest. Derek needs to stop enabling it because it is not helping her. Patricia said something I couldn't quite make out. Something that sounded careful and non-committal. The diplomatic register she used when she was managing someone she didn't fully trust. I know, Vanessa said, as though Patricia had agreed with her. It's just hard to watch. She's his mother and we love her, but enough is enough. She has to start taking accountability. I set the mug down on Patricia's coffee table. I looked at the far wall, which had a framed print of a lighthouse that Patricia had bought at a craft fair in 2009, and which I had always thought was a little ordinary, but had never said so. No real savings. She didn't know. She genuinely did not know. She was telling my family, with confidence and apparent compassion, a version of my financial reality that was not just incomplete, but almost comically inverted. She was describing a woman who barely existed, a shadow, a burden, a cautionary figure, and she was doing it in my name, without my presence, to people who might not know enough to question it. And she was doing it, I understood clearly in that moment, because she believed it. She had constructed a narrative about me that made her position in this family morally coherent. She was the competent one, the forward-thinking one, the one who saw reality clearly while Derek was too soft and too loyal to tell his mother hard truths. As long as I was the financial dependent, she was the stable center. As long as I was the loser, she was the winner by comparison. The story she'd built about me served her. That was why she kept telling it, not just out of cruelty, though there was cruelty in it, but out of necessity. She needed me to be what she decided I was, because if I wasn't that, then she had to look at something else, something more uncomfortable, herself. Patricia came back into the living room. She looked at my face and she understood immediately. Marina, it's all right, I said. She doesn't know what she's talking about. I know she doesn't, I said. That's almost the worst part. Patricia sat down across from me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very carefully, "What are you going to do?" I picked up my mug again. The coffee had gone lukewarm while I sat there not drinking it, which felt like an apt metaphor for something, though I was too tired to figure out what. "I'm going to let her keep talking," I said, "for a little while longer." Patricia looked at me. And then I thought about Helen's voice on the phone. I thought about the document spread across my kitchen table. I thought about 14% and an unsigned repayment clause and a commercial property in Milford that had quadrupled in value while my daughter-in-law was telling people I had no real savings. And then I said, everyone is going to hear the truth all at once from me. Patricia was very quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, once slowly, the nod of a woman who had been hoping for exactly this and hadn't known how to ask for it. I finished my coffee. We talked about other things, and when I drove home that afternoon through the October dark, the burning trees were almost bare now, the gold nearly gone, the branches beginning to show through, and I thought about how trees don't die when they lose their leaves. They pull everything back into themselves, deep into the roots, and they wait. I had been losing leaves for a long time. I was not dead. I was waiting. Helen confirmed the timeline on a Thursday. The meeting she was helping me prepare was not a legal action, not yet, and possibly not ever, because what I wanted was not a courtroom. What I wanted was a room with my family in it, and the truth on the table, and nowhere left to hide. You understand, Helen said, that once you do this, things will change. That's the point, I said. I mean permanently, she said. There's no version of this where everyone goes back to what they were before. You reveal this, you disrupt their picture of their life, and that disruption doesn't unhappen. Helen, I said, their picture of their life is built on my sacrifice and my silence. I'm not obligated to maintain it. She looked at me for a long moment, then she said, no, you're not. We scheduled it for the following week, a family meeting framed on my end as something routine, something about estate planning I would tell Derek, which was not entirely untrue, a chance to get everyone together to go over some things, to be organized. Derek, when I called him, seemed relieved to have an explanation for why his mother was reaching out. He agreed quickly. He said Vanessa would appreciate the chance to talk through some of these things as a family. Jan had no idea what he was agreeing to. None of them did. And for the first time in months, maybe longer, maybe much longer than I wanted to admit, I went to bed that night and I slept without waking up at 3 a.m. with my chest tight and my thoughts running. I slept like a woman with a plan. The morning of the meeting, I woke up at 5:47 without an alarm. I lay in bed for a few minutes and looked at the ceiling and did an inventory of myself the way you do before something you can't take back. My hands were steady. My chest was clear. I didn't have the tight, pressurized feeling I'd been waking up with for months. What I had instead was something quieter and more deliberate, the specific calm of a person who has already done the hard internal work and is now simply waiting for the external world to catch up. I got up, I made coffee, I ironed the blouse I'd set out the night before. Navy blue, simple, the kind of thing that says I am not here to impress you, I am here to be taken seriously. I ate toast standing at the counter because I wasn't particularly hungry and I didn't want to perform a breakfast I didn't feel. I looked at the folder on my kitchen table. Helen had organized everything into a clean, tabbed document. Not because the drama required theatre, but because the truth required clarity. Every page numbered, every figure annotated, everything in order. I picked it up, I put it in my bag. I drove to Derek's house in Clover Ridge for the second time in a month. And this time the trees were mostly bare, the gold completely gone, the branches exposed and skeletal against a pale November sky. There was something honest about November. It didn't pretend. They were all there when I arrived. Derek had set up the dining room, the same table with the candles that were not lit this time, with chairs arranged in a loose circle, which told me he'd been thinking about this as a family conversation rather than a presentation. That was fine. It would become a presentation regardless. Patricia was there, sitting slightly apart from the others, with her hands folded in her lap. And she looked at me when I walked in with an expression that was equal parts apprehension and something I recognized as quiet solidarity. Caleb was beside Tess on the far side of the room, and he gave me a small nod, the nod of someone who knew more than he was showing. Marcus was there because Marcus was always there, already eating something from a plate he'd apparently constructed from Derek's kitchen without asking anyone. And Vanessa. She was seated at what I thought of privately as her head of table position, not at the literal head, but at the social center, the chair that broadcast authority, the position from which she typically managed rooms. She was dressed well. Her posture was composed. She had the look of a woman who had been told this was an estate planning conversation and had arrived prepared to be gracious and reasonable and slightly bored. She smiled when I walked in, warm, almost kind. Marina, she said, glad you made it. We were just getting settled. Thank you for having me, I said. I sat across from her. I set my bag on the floor beside my chair. I did not take out the folder yet. Derek said, so Mom, you mentioned you wanted to go over some things, estate stuff, right? Some financial organization? Something like that, I said. Great. I think it's good to be on the same page as a family. He had the slightly over-bright tone of a man trying to make something feel normal, that he privately suspected was not going to be normal. My son had always been perceptive in the way people are perceptive when they're also very good at looking in the other way. Before we get into the documents, I said, I want to say something. The room shifted almost imperceptibly, that change in air pressure that happens when people sense something is coming. I want to say it directly, and I want everyone to hear it, because I'm tired of things in this family living in the space between what's said and what's true. I looked around the room, at Patricia, at Caleb, at Marcus, who had put down his plate, at Derek, whose jaw had tightened slightly, and then at Vanessa, who was still composed, still pleasant, still in control of her expression in that practiced way she had. 3 weeks ago, I said, at this table, I was told I was a burden. I was told I had survived on the goodwill of this family. I was called, I paused, not for effect, but because even saying it required something from me, a loser, someone with no plan and no future, someone whose failure was a matter of character. The room was very quiet. Since then, I continued, those ideas have been shared more broadly with relatives, with people who weren't at that dinner, framed as concern, framed as honesty. I did not look at Vanessa when I said this. I looked at the table. I want to address that, not to be vindictive, because the truth has been absent from this family's conversation for too long, and I am the only one who can put it back. I reached down and took the folder from my bag. Derek said, Mom, in a voice that sounded like the beginning of an attempt to manage the situation, and I said, gently but very clearly, let me finish, Derek. He stopped. I opened the folder. I did not rush. In 2014, I said, Derek's business was in serious trouble. His partner had been misappropriating funds. He had creditors. He had exposure that could have destroyed not just the business, but his personal finances. I watched Derek's face go very still. He came to me. I helped him. That help included, I turned to the first tab section, a loan co-signature that attached my name and my credit to his business debt. That document, as of today, has never been formally discharged. My name is still on it. I set the page on the table. I heard Vanessa's breathing change, not dramatically, just the small, almost inaudible adjustment of someone recalibrating. It also included a private funding agreement, I continued, through which I provided capital to stabilize the business after the partner was removed. That agreement included a repayment clause signed by Derek. I set that page on the table beside the first. No payment has ever been made. No renegotiation was ever requested. The clause still exists. Derek's face had gone from still to something I can only describe as blanched. The color had left it in the specific way that color leaves a face when a person realizes that something they buried is now above ground in a room full of people. Mom, he said. His voice was different now, quieter, the brightness entirely gone. I know, I said, and I meant it, not cruelly. I genuinely meant I know what this is for you. I know how this feels, but I could not stop. And there's one more thing. I turned to the third tab section. When I helped restructure Derek's business in 2014, part of the agreement included an equity position, 14% of the firm. I set the page on the table. That equity was never bought out. It was never dissolved. It has simply existed on paper for 11 years while the business grew. I looked up. Derek's firm is worth considerably more today than it was in 2014. 14% of its current valuation is not a trivial number. The room held its breath. And then I looked at Vanessa. She was not composed anymore. The pleasantness was gone. Not replaced by anything dramatic, not by anger or tears, just by a kind of blankness, the face a person makes when the architecture they've been standing on drops 3 feet without warning, and they haven't yet processed whether they're still standing or falling. The stability of this household, I said carefully, the business, the financial security that supports this life in Clover Ridge. It did not come from nothing. It came in significant part from decisions I made in 2014 that I have never asked to be acknowledged, never asked to be repaid, and never made into a point of leverage, until now. I closed the folder. I am not here to destroy anything. I am here because I was called a loser at this table by someone who has been living, without knowing it, on the foundation I built, and I would like that to be understood. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in that room. Marcus said, "Holy," and then stopped himself, which may have been the first self-aware thing I had ever witnessed him do. Patricia had her hand over her mouth, not in a theatrical way, in the way of someone genuinely absorbing something they hadn't known and feeling the weight of not having known it. Caleb was looking at the table. He had known something was coming, but not the specific shape of it, and I could see him working through it in real time, the recalibration, the recontextualization of everything he thought he'd understood about this family. Derek was looking at the folder on the table. He hadn't moved. He looked for a moment like a much younger man, like the 31-year-old who had sat in my kitchen with his head down, overwhelmed by the size of what he was in. And Vanessa was looking at me, and what was in her face, I want to describe this carefully because I don't want to overstate it or make it into something cinematic that it wasn't. What was in her face was the specific expression of a person who has just discovered that the story they've been telling is not the story that actually happened. Not guilt, not yet, not remorse. Something prior to that, something more like the vertigo of a reality that has suddenly reorganized itself. She opened her mouth. She closed it. Then she said, in a voice that was considerably less steady than any voice I'd heard from her before, there must be some misunderstanding. There isn't, I said. Derek. She turned to him. Derek, explain this. Tell her, tell everyone. Vanessa. Derek's voice was flat. It was the voice of a man who was holding a great deal very tightly and did not trust himself to hold more. Stop. She stopped. I think it was the only time I had ever seen her stop at Derek's instruction without immediately finding another angle. Did you know? She said to him, quieter now, directed only at him as though the rest of us had momentarily ceased to exist. About all of this, the equity, the repayment clause? Derek was quiet for a long moment. I knew about the funding, he said. I knew she'd helped. He stopped. I didn't look at it as carefully as I should have. Over the years, I let it become. He stopped again. He couldn't quite find the end of that sentence, probably because all the honest endings to it were devastating. You let it become forgotten, I said, not attacking, just completing. He looked at me. His eyes were red in the way that men's eyes get red when they're absorbing something they don't know how to cry about yet. Yeah, he said, I did. Mom, We don't have to do that part right now, I said. That's a different conversation. This one is about something else. I turned back to Vanessa. She had been listening to this exchange with an expression that had moved through several stages very quickly. The vertigo, then something defensive, then something that flickered close to shame before she seemed to consciously redirect it into a different posture. The posture of someone about to reframe. Marina, she said, and her voice had recovered some of its usual quality, that measured, reasonable, I am the adult in the room register. I understand that you feel it. Vanessa, I said. She paused. I would like you to not tell me what I feel, I said. I have sat at your table and listened to you tell me what I am for the last time. I know what I feel. I'm asking you to look at what's in front of you. Something moved through her face. Something that wasn't quite ready to be named, but that had the shape of a person being seen through. Not just criticized, but actually seen in a way she wasn't accustomed to and didn't know how to deflect. I have been managing this family's financial stability quietly for over a decade, I said. I did not ask for credit. I did not ask for gratitude beyond basic decency. But I will not sit at your table and be called a loser while the house around us exists because of what I chose to sacrifice. That is not something I'm willing to absorb anymore. Patricia made a small sound. I thought she might be crying. I didn't look over. The thing about a room where the truth has just landed is that it doesn't organize itself neatly. Real moments don't. There was a period of several minutes after I finished speaking where the room was full of people processing at different speeds, and the sounds were strange. Caleb clearing his throat, Marcus shifting in his chair, Derek's controlled breathing, Vanessa very still in a way that was the opposite of her usual stillness, which was the stillness of confidence. This was the stillness of someone who didn't know where to step. Then Vanessa said, and I'll give her this much, she tried. I want to clarify what I said at dinner. I was not trying to, and it came out wrong. I was trying to express concern. You called me a loser, I said. On the phone to Patricia later, I heard you. Her eyes went to Patricia, sharp and involuntary, and Patricia met her gaze with something that was entirely unlike her usual diplomatic neutrality. "I was there," Patricia said simply. Vanessa looked back at me. The reframe was not working. I could see her trying to find the angle and not finding it, because there wasn't one, because I hadn't come here to argue about feelings or intent or the generous interpretation of cruelty. I had come with documents. I had come with numbers. I had come with the irreducible fact of what I had done and what had been done to me in return. "I think," Derek said, and his voice was careful and exhausted in equal measure, "that we need to acknowledge," he looked at Vanessa and then away from her, "that things have been said that should not have been said, and that there are things about our situation, about our financial situation, that I should have been more transparent about with everyone, including you." He was talking to Vanessa now, but also to me, and the sentence was doing double work, carrying two separate admissions at once. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was something, and it was the first honest thing I had heard Derek say in longer than I wanted to calculate, and I allowed it to register without letting it become more than it was. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, with the blunt simplicity of a man who had been following the room's emotional current and decided someone needed to name the next step. "Now," I said, "we're all in the same room with the same information. What everyone does with that is their own business." I looked at Vanessa, then at Derek. "But I'm done managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own dignity. That ends here." Vanessa looked like she had more to say. I could see it, the arguments queued up behind her eyes, the explanations, the alternate framings, the version of events in which her behavior was understandable and I was the one who had escalated something that could have been handled privately. But the documents were on the table, and every person in the room had read them or would read them, and there are specific irreversible moments when the air in a room changes and everyone knows it, and no amount of reframing can change it back. This was one of those moments. I looked at the folder on the table, everything I had spent 11 years protecting without asking for anything in return, reduced now to paper and numbers. And somehow that reduction was also a clarification. It made things visible. It made the invisible work of love and sacrifice into something that could be pointed to, and that pointing was not greedy or vindictive, it was simply true. There is something profound and painful about having to prove your value to people who should have already known it, something that leaves a mark even when you win. I did not feel triumphant sitting at that table. I felt, if I'm honest, enormously tired and sad. The particular sadness of a woman who had hoped, somewhere in the back of her quietly patient heart, that this meeting would not have to happen, that someone would have said, at some point before today, "I see what you did. I see what it cost. Thank you." Nobody had. So I had said it myself, in the only language that some people understand, documented, legal, irrefutable. I closed the folder. I set it neatly in front of me. I folded my hands on top of it, and I waited for the first time for them to figure out what came next. Derek asked me to stay after the others had filtered out. Caleb had left first, with a brief, firm hand on my shoulder as he passed, that said more than any sentence would have. Marcus had gone without making eye contact with anyone, which for Marcus was practically a standing ovation of self-restraint. Patricia had hugged me at the door, a real hug, both arms, held longer than social convention required, and said nothing, which was the right call. Vanessa had gone upstairs. I heard her footsteps on the ceiling above us, deliberate, not running, but fast. The footsteps of a woman going somewhere to be alone with what had just happened to her. Derek and I sat at the cleared table. He had poured himself a glass of water and was holding it with both hands like it was the only fixed point in a moving room. "I didn't know about the equity clause," he said. "I want you to know that. I genuinely... It slipped. I know that sounds... It sounds like something that was convenient to let slip," I said. Not cruelly, just honestly. He nodded. He didn't argue. That too was something. "I should have defended you," he said, "at dinner when I should have said something." "Yes," I said, "you should have. I don't know why I didn't. He rubbed his face with one hand. That's not entirely true. I know why. I just don't like the reason. What's the reason? I was quiet for a moment. It's easier, he said. It's easier to let things go with Vanessa than to have the fight. She doesn't forget things. She holds them. And I've gotten into the habit of, he stopped, of choosing the path that doesn't cost me anything that night. Even when it costs someone else everything, I said. He looked at me. His eyes were wet now, not spilling but wet. I'm sorry, Mom, he said. I looked at my son, this man I had held as a baby, this person who had sat in my kitchen destroyed, and whom I had quietly rebuilt without once making him feel small for needing it. This person I had loved more than anything I could name, who had let his wife call me a loser and said nothing. The love was still there. It had not gone anywhere. That was the complicated truth about being a mother. The love doesn't leave just because the person fails you. It stays and it aches and it asks you what you're going to do with it. I hear you, I said, and I believe you. I picked up the folder. But I need you to understand that sorry is a beginning, Derek. It is not an end. What happens next is what matters. He nodded slowly. I stood up. I picked up my bag. I looked at my son one more time. This imperfect, complicated, genuinely remorseful man who had a great deal of work ahead of him. I love you, I said. That part doesn't change, but some other parts are going to have to. I walked to the door. I put on my coat. And I drove home through the bare November afternoon with the folder in my passenger seat and something in my chest that wasn't quite peace but was unmistakably the first solid ground I had stood on in a very long time. The days after the meeting were strange in the way that the days after a storm are strange. Not peaceful exactly, but different. The air had changed. The pressure had changed. Things that had been obscured were now visible. And visibility, I was learning, is its own kind of weather. I did not hear from Vanessa. I had not expected to, but her silence had a particular texture that I found myself paying attention to in the way you pay attention to something that tells you more by its absence than its presence. Derek called on the second day, brief, cautious, the voice of a man walking carefully across ice he'd just been told was thinner than he thought. He said he wanted to make sure I'd gotten home safely, which was a strange thing to say 2 days after the fact, but which I understood as a proxy for something he didn't yet know how to say directly. I told him I was fine. I told him I appreciated the call. I left space for him to say more if he wanted to. Han didn't. Not yet. But the call itself was something, the reaching toward rather than the drifting away, the choice to dial rather than wait. I was in the middle of noting that distinction in my yellow legal pad. I had started using it for observations as well as facts, which felt like evidence of something shifting in me. When my phone rang with an unknown number that turned out to be Vanessa, I sat with the ringing phone in my hand for 2 full rings. Then I answered. Marina. Her voice was different from any version of it I had heard before. Not the warm, controlled register of her social self. Not the pleasant, sharp tone she used when she was doing damage while appearing reasonable. This was something stripped of its usual equipment. It was the voice of a person who had spent 2 days in a room with the truth and found it very uncomfortable company. Vanessa, I said, I want to talk. A pause. Can we talk? We're talking now, I said. I was not trying to be difficult. I just had no interest in making it easy for her to postpone the actual thing she needed to say by first negotiating the terms of saying it. She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her recalibrating. I owe you an apology, she said. All right, I said. What I said at dinner, she stopped, started again. What I said was not fair, and I know that. I should not have said those things in front of everyone. I listened to that for a moment, the specific shape of it. Vanessa, I said, do you understand what you're apologizing for? I said things that were hurtful. You told a room full of people that I was a burden who had been carried by my son, I said. You told Patricia I had no real savings and no real plan. You called me a loser, not once, repeatedly, to multiple people over several weeks. And you did all of that while living in a house that exists in significant part because of what I sacrificed. I said it evenly. I wasn't raising my voice. I had no desire to perform anger that had already been processed into something more useful. So I want to know, when you apologize, do you understand what you're apologizing for? The thing itself? Not just that it was hurtful, but that it was false, and that you spread that falsehood actively and confidently, as though you had authority to define my life. The silence on the other end was long. I didn't know, she said finally. No, I agreed. You didn't, but you didn't ask either. You constructed a story about me and you told it to people, and you never once considered that you might be wrong. That is not just unkindness, Vanessa. That is a specific kind of arrogance. I heard something on the other end of the line that I thought for a moment might be crying. Then it resolved into the sound of a breath being taken and held and released slowly, the sound of someone keeping themselves together through effort. I understand, she said. I understand what you're saying. Good, I said, and I meant it, not as dismissal, as acknowledgement. Understanding was the beginning of something, even if it was a painful beginning. I'm glad you called, but I'm not ready to have the rest of this conversation yet. When I am, I'll reach out. Another pause. Okay, she said. Okay, I understand. We hung up. I set the phone on the table. I looked at the yellow legal pad. I had expected to feel something cleaner after that call. Some sense of the scales tipping, of justice taking a visible shape. What I felt instead was complicated and human and hard to name. Something that lived in the territory between grief and relief, and the specific exhaustion of being right about something you wished you were wrong about. I put the cap back on my pen. I went to make tea. What I did not anticipate, what nobody anticipates, I think, until they've been through it, was the way the aftermath organized itself along the lines of who people actually were rather than who they'd been pretending to be. B called me. B, my cousin, who had apparently been on the receiving end of at least two of Vanessa's reframings of my character, called me on a Thursday morning and spoke for almost 20 minutes in a register of extended apology that I found both touching and slightly exhausting. She made it sound so, Bea kept saying. She made it sound like you were, I should have called you directly instead of just listening to her version. And Marina, I'm sorry, I feel terrible. Don't feel terrible, I said. Feel instructed. What does that mean? It means that when someone tells you a story about a person who isn't in the room, I said, the decent thing, the thing that costs very little and protects a great deal, is to pick up the phone and call that person before you decide what's true. B was quiet. You're right, she said. That's completely right. I know, I said, and now you know too, so that's something. What I did not say to Bea, but thought afterward, was how much easier everything would have been if a single person in that chain of whispered family gossip had paused long enough to perform that basic check. If one person had said, wait, let me call Marina, the erosion of my reputation in that family, however temporary, had not required Vanessa to be particularly clever. It had only required everyone else to be a little bit lazy with the truth, a little bit willing to accept a story that had the shape of something plausible without doing the work of confirming it. That is how reputations get dismantled, not through dramatic attacks, through small, unverified acceptances. I filed that understanding away somewhere deep. It was the kind of thing I wanted to carry forward. Marcus, surprisingly, was the one who said the thing that cracked me open a little. He showed up at my apartment on a Saturday, unannounced, which was absolutely his signature move, regardless of the occasion, carrying a fast food bag and looking like a man who had rehearsed something and was now hoping to deliver it before he lost his nerve. Marina, he said when I opened the door, I need to tell you something, and I need to say it before I talk myself out of it. I stood back and let him in. He set the fast food bag on my kitchen table with the comfortable familiarity of a person who has never once considered that their presence might be an imposition, sat down and looked at me. I laughed, he said, at dinner when she was going at you. I laughed at something she said because I was uncomfortable, and that's what I do when I'm uncomfortable. And I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks and I feel like garbage about it. I looked at Marcus. This large, loud, well-meaning man who took food from other people's kitchens without asking and talked about himself too much, and was underneath all of that genuinely soft-hearted in a way he rarely let show. "You did," I said. "I remember." "I know." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm sorry. I should have, I don't know, said something, done something. Instead, I just laughed and ate my food," and he shook his head. "That's not who I want to be." There was something in that, in the unglamorous honesty of it, the admission without excuse, that hit me differently than Vanessa's phone call or even Derek's red-eyed apology at the table. This was not a person managing optics. This was a person genuinely embarrassed by themselves. "Marcus," I said, "you didn't call me a loser. You didn't spread stories about me to the family. You laughed nervously at a dinner because you were uncomfortable." I paused. "That's not great, but it's also not the main event." "Still," he said. "Still," I agreed. "Thank you for saying it." He opened his fast food bag and looked at it, and then, apparently remembering where he was, looked back up at me with the slight sheepishness of a person realizing they brought lunch to someone else's house and eaten without offering. "You want some fries?" he said. I almost laughed. I didn't quite, but it was close. "No," I said, "thank you," and ate his fries. We sat in my kitchen and talked for a while about nothing in particular. His job, a home repair he'd been avoiding, the completely unrelated drama of a neighbor of his who had beef with the local parking authority. It was the most normal 20 minutes I'd had in a month, and I needed it more than I would have predicted. The conversation with Derek that actually mattered happened on a Sunday, 12 days after the meeting. He came alone. He had called ahead, which was new, and he'd asked if he could come over and talk, which was also new. Derek typically announced his visits in the same breath as executing them, the scheduling and the arrival nearly simultaneous. That he had called a day in advance and asked rather than told me something about the work he was doing internally. Hum sat at my kitchen table. This table was doing a great deal of narrative work in this period of my life. And I made coffee that neither of us really needed, and we sat with it, and for a while neither of us said the main thing. "How's Vanessa?" I asked, not because I was primarily concerned about Vanessa, but because I was curious whether he would be honest about how things were between them. "Struggling," he said. He looked at his coffee. She took it hard, the meeting. She didn't expect." He stopped. "She's had to look at some things about herself that she'd been avoiding." "That's not the worst thing that can happen to a person," I said. "No," he agreed. "It's just uncomfortable." He turned the coffee mug in his hands. "She's not, Marina, I want to be honest with you about Vanessa. She's not a bad person. She got very attached to a version of our life and of who we are, and she protected that version aggressively. And she looked at you and she saw a threat to it, not because of anything real, but because," he stopped again, "because if you were struggling, then we were safe. If you were the one who needed help, then we were the ones who had it together." And that made her feel better about things she was privately insecure about. I listened to this. It was the most analytical and emotionally literate thing I had heard Derek say in several years, possibly longer. "That's a generous interpretation," I said. "Maybe," he said. "I'm still working out what's generous and what's accurate. Those can be different things." "I know." He finally met my eyes. "Mom, I need to tell you something that I should have said a long time ago. Not just about the documents, about what you did in 2014. He swallowed. "I knew when you helped me what it cost you. I knew about the retirement fund penalty. You didn't tell me, but I knew because I looked at what was possible and what you had, and I did the math." He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I told myself it would be temporary, that I'd fix it, that I'd rebuild it for you. And then time passed, and the business grew, and life got busy, and I stopped looking at it deliberately, because looking at it meant feeling something I didn't want to feel." "Which was what?" I said quietly. "Indebted," he said, "ashamed. And I think I let Vanessa's version of you become comfortable for me because it made the shame easier. If you were someone who needed carrying, then I wasn't someone who had failed to pay back an enormous debt. I was just doing my part, being a good son." The thing about honesty is that it asks something of the person receiving it too. It asks you not to run from it, not to soften it back into something comfortable, just because it's painful to hear. Derek was sitting across from me telling me something true about himself that was genuinely hard to hear. That his silence had not been passive, that it had been, at least in part, convenient. That he had let his wife diminish me because diminishing me had made his own failure easier to live with. That was not the Derek I had raised, but it was the Derek who had happened in the years I wasn't watching closely enough. And the question was not whether it hurt. It did, precisely and deeply. But what to do with it now that it was in the open. Thank you, I said, for saying that. I mean it, he said. I know you do. I set my coffee down. Derek, I'm not going to pretend this is resolved. What you just described, letting someone else's cruelty serve your own comfort, that's something you have to sit with for a long time. Not something you apologize for and move past. I know, he said. And the financial situation, I continued, we need to address it formally. Through Helen, I'm not trying to take anything from you, but I need the loose ends closed. The co-signature discharged, the repayment agreement renegotiated into something real, the equity position formally addressed. Whatever that looks like, it needs to happen on paper. He nodded. Absolutely, whatever you need. It's not what I need, I said. It's what's right. There's a difference. I've spent too long confusing those two things. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Are you angry at me? I thought about it. The real answer, not the diplomatic one. I'm sad, I said. I think sad is more accurate. Angry burned off pretty quickly. What's underneath it is sad. I looked at him. You're my son, Derek. That is a fact that nothing that's happened changes. But I have to be honest with you. The relationship between us has been operating on an imbalance for a long time, and I let it because letting it felt like love, and I didn't want to examine the difference. I'm done not examining things. His eyes were wet again. He didn't try to hide it this time. What do you need from me, he said. Not in terms of money or legal things. I mean, what do you actually need? I thought about that. Really thought about it. I need you to be someone your wife cannot convince to stay silent while I'm being humiliated, I said. I need you to be the person you were before you got comfortable. Before the path of least resistance became the default. I paused. Can you be that person? I didn't answer immediately, which I respected. A quick yes would have meant nothing. The pause meant he was actually weighing it, actually holding himself up against what I was asking. I'm going to try, he said. I know you probably need more than that. Trying is where it starts, I said. But Derek, I need you to understand that if you stop trying, I will stop waiting. I am 62 years old and I have spent too much of my life waiting for people to treat me the way I have treated them. That stops now. Not because I stopped loving you, because I started finally loving myself with the same consistency. He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved through his face, complex and unresolved and genuine. Okay, he said. Okay, Mom. We finished the coffee. He helped me wash the cups, which was a small thing and also not a small thing. He hugged me at the door, a real hug, not the distracted kiss on the cheek he'd been giving me for years. And he held it for a second longer than he usually would. After he left, I stood in the hallway of my apartment, and I let myself feel the full complicated weight of that conversation. The love and the anger and the grief and the cautious, fragile opening of something that might, if tended carefully, become real trust again. Not the trust I'd given reflexively because he was my child. The trust that gets built deliberately, from evidence, from action, from showing up when it costs you something. That kind of trust takes time. I was willing to give it time, but I was not willing to give it blindly anymore. Vanessa came to see me 10 days after her phone call. She asked formally by text message another thing I noted. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in clothes that were notably quieter than her usual presentation. No statement jewelry, no blown out hair. She looked honestly like someone who had been through something and hadn't quite come out the other side yet. I made tea. We sat in the living room, not the kitchen. I was not ready to offer the kitchen, which was my room, the room where I worked and thought and kept my yellow legal pad. She held her mug in both hands. I've been thinking, she said, about what you said, about the arrogance, about constructing a story without checking it. She paused. You were right about all of it. I had built a narrative about you that served me, and I never questioned it." And she stopped. "That's a hard thing to look at." "Yes," I said, "it is." "I don't," she started, then redirected. "I'm not going to tell you I didn't mean to hurt you. I think on some level I did. I think I wanted to establish something about where I stood in this family, and I chose the wrong way to do that, a cruel way." She met my eyes. "I'm sorry, Marina. Not sorry that you found out. Sorry that I did it." I sat with that for a moment. The distinction she was drawing. Not apologizing for consequence, apologizing for action. That was a harder and more honest apology than most people manage. "I hear you," I said. "I know that's not enough on its own," she said. "No," I agreed. "It's not, but it's honest, and honest is what I need from people right now more than anything else." I set my mug down. "Vanessa, I'm not your enemy. I was never your enemy. But I will not be the person in this family who absorbs damage quietly to keep the peace. I've done that for too long, and I'm done." She nodded. She looked for a moment genuinely young, stripped of the armor she usually wore, uncertain in a way she almost never permitted herself to appear. "Can we?" she started. "Is there a way through this for the family?" "That depends," I said, "on what everyone does next." I meant it, not as a threat, as a simple, unvarnished truth. The way through was not going to be declared or decided in a living room over tea. It was going to be built slowly from the choices everyone made in the weeks and months ahead, from whether Derek continued to show up, from whether Vanessa's remorse was a phase or a foundation, from whether the family as a whole could metabolize the truth and become something more honest than it had been. I didn't know the answer. I don't think anyone did. But for the first time in a very long time, the question was at least being asked, and I was done pretending that was enough on its own. The asking was the beginning. The living of it was everything after. I stood up when she left. I closed the door. I walked to the window and looked out at the street below. Bare November trees, a thin grey sky, a neighbor walking a dog that was pulling towards something interesting on the sidewalk and being gently redirected. Ordinary life happening in all directions. I had been so deep inside the pain of the last month that I had almost forgotten the existence of ordinary life, of days that were not about this, of hours that belonged to something other than the work of being wronged, and the harder work of deciding what to do about it. I stood at the window for a long time, and then I went to the kitchen and I picked up the yellow legal pad and I turned to a fresh page. Not to document anything, not to build a case or take notes on someone else's behavior. I wrote at the top of the page in my own handwriting, "What do I want now?" And I sat down to answer it. The yellow legal pad has sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I wrote anything on it. Not because I didn't have answers, because I had too many, and they were arriving in the wrong order, tangled up with grief and relief, and the residue of anger that hadn't fully metabolized yet. I'd learned in 62 years that the answers that come too quickly are usually the answers you already had before you asked the question. The real ones take longer. They require you to sit in the discomfort of not knowing and resist the urge to fill the silence with something familiar. So I let the page stay blank. I made coffee in the mornings. I walked in the afternoons, long walks, the kind I hadn't taken since before the layoff, when the days had collapsed into apartment walls and unanswered job applications, and the specific quiet desperation of a person who had defined herself through her work and was now standing in the rubble of that definition. The walks helped. November had turned into something almost beautiful once I stopped resenting its bareness. All those stripped trees, showing their actual shapes, the architecture of themselves visible for the first time since spring. I thought about what my mother used to say, "Carry your weight and then some." I had carried it. I had carried it for decades, without complaint and without accounting, and I had told myself that was strength. What I understood now, walking through those bare November streets, was that it was also partly fear. Fear of what would happen if I put something down. Fear of being the kind of person who makes demands, who takes up space, who says, "I need something back from this." I had been so determined not to be a burden that I had made myself invisible. and invisible things, as I had learned, get walked on without anyone noticing. The invisibility was over. I had made sure of that. But the question of what came next, what I actually wanted my life to look like, stripped of the role I'd been performing, that was the harder work. And harder work, I had learned, cannot be rushed. On the fourth day, I picked up the pen. Helen and I met the following week to begin the formal process of closing the financial loose ends. I want to be clear about what that looked like, because I think people imagine these moments as more dramatic than they are. There was no confrontation, no ultimatum delivered across a desk with a lawyer present on both sides like a courtroom scene. Derek had agreed, without significant resistance, to everything Helen outlined: the co-signature discharge, the formal renegotiation of the repayment agreement into something real and structured, the equity position addressed through a buyout arrangement that Helen had priced conservatively and that Derek's firm, given its current health, could manage without crisis. He signed everything within 10 days. He did not negotiate the terms down. He did not try to minimize what was owed. He sat in Helen's office and he signed, and afterward he called me and said, "It's done. And I want you to know I'm glad it's done. I should have done this years ago." "Yes," I said, "you should have." "I know." A pause. "Does it help, knowing it's formalized?" I thought about that honestly. "It helps in the way that setting a broken bone helps," I said. "It's not comfortable, but at least things are in the right position now." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That's a very mom way to put it." "I am in fact your mother," I said. And there it was. Something almost normal, almost light, in a conversation that had been heavy for months. Not resolution, not the erasure of everything that had happened. Just a moment of recognizable warmth between two people who were trying, imperfectly, to find their way back to something real. That was enough for that day. I was learning to let things be enough for that day. The question of Vanessa was more complicated, and I want to be honest about that because I think the honest version is more useful than the clean version. She did not transform. That is the first thing I'll say. People who tell you that someone like Vanessa has a revelation and becomes a different person are usually telling you a story that serves a narrative rather than the truth. What happened was smaller and more real than transformation. What happened was that Vanessa, stripped of the version of reality she'd built and forced to operate inside actual facts, became careful, quieter, more measured in how she spoke about people who weren't in the room. Whether that was genuine internal change or just the behavior of a person who had learned that the ground could disappear if she wasn't watching, I honestly couldn't tell you. Maybe she couldn't either. What I could tell you was that she stopped. She stopped the phone calls to relatives. She stopped the reframings of my life that had been traveling through the family like a low-grade fever. She stopped presenting herself as the concerned, forward-thinking voice of reason about a woman she had never actually known. That stopping was not nothing. It was not everything, but it was not nothing. Caleb told me sometime in December that Vanessa had said something to him that surprised him. He recounted it carefully, the way you recount something you know might matter to the person you're telling. She said she'd underestimated you, he said, to me. Not in a group, not publicly, just to me when we were talking about something else entirely. She said, "I underestimated Marina. I think I do that with people I feel threatened by." I held that for a moment. "Did she seem like she meant it?" I asked. Caleb considered. She seemed like someone who'd figured something out that was uncomfortable to have figured out, which is about as close to sincere as Vanessa gets, I think. "That might have to be enough," I said. "Is it?" he asked. "For now," I said. "I don't need her to be my friend. I need her to stop treating me like a problem she's managing. If she can do that, if she can simply treat me like a person, that's a reasonable baseline." Caleb nodded slowly. "And Derek?" "Derek," I said, "is doing the work." I thought about it. Slowly, imperfectly, but he's doing it. That was true. In the weeks after the meeting and the legal agreements and the hard Sunday conversation in my kitchen, Derek had started showing up in ways that were quiet and consistent. The kind of showing up that doesn't announce itself but accumulates into something you can rely on. He called on Tuesdays again, Not every Tuesday and not always for long, but enough that the pattern re-established itself. He asked questions and then listened to the answers without simultaneously composing his response. He remembered things I mentioned and referenced them later, which sounds small and is, in fact, enormous. Once, and this was the one that stayed with me, he was at a family gathering at Patricia's house in December, and someone made a passing comment about my unemployment that had a particular edge to it, and Derek said, calmly and without making a production of it, "Mom's got more going on professionally than most people half her age. I'd be careful about that assumption." And then he moved on, and the conversation moved on, and he didn't look at me to see if I'd noticed, but I noticed. And I did not say anything, and later in the car driving home I let myself feel it. The simple, almost unbearably welcome feeling of being defended by my son, not dramatically, not with fanfare, just steadily, the way reliable things are steady. It was not the resolution of everything, it was the beginning of the rebuilding. And I was, by that point, enough of a realist to understand the difference and enough of an optimist to value the beginning. The job came in January and it surprised me. Not because I hadn't been looking. I had, steadily and without panic, in the new way I was doing most things, which was with intention rather than desperation. But because it came from an entirely unexpected direction. A former colleague named Donna, who I had worked with 15 years ago and largely lost touch with, reached out through a professional contact and asked if I'd be interested in a consulting position with a mid-sized development company that was restructuring its project management division. "They need someone who's done this before," Donna said over the phone, her voice warm and practical in equal measure. "Not someone who needs to learn, someone who already knows where the problems hide. I thought of you immediately." "Why me?" I asked. Not false modesty, genuine curiosity. "Because in 15 years, Donna said, I have never once seen you panic. And that company is about to go through something that requires someone who doesn't panic." I thought about the drawer of documents, the yellow legal pad, the October dinner and the November meeting, and the weeks of patient, deliberate work that had preceded both. "I don't panic," I agreed. "I know," she said. "So, are you interested?" I was. I told her so. I told her I'd send my updated materials by end of week, and I did. And by the 3rd week of January, I had accepted the position and had a start date and was sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, looking at the calendar, feeling not triumphant, not vindicated, but something more durable than either of those things. Solid. I felt solid. Not because the job proved anything to anyone who had doubted me. Vanessa's voice calling me a loser at that dinner table was not a voice I needed a job offer to silence. I had already silenced it. I had silenced it by understanding, clearly and finely, that the opinion of a person who doesn't know you is not a verdict, it's just noise. And I had spent too many years treating other people's noise like testimony. The job felt good because it was mine, because I had found it on my own terms in my own time, without shrinking myself to fit someone else's expectation of what a 62-year-old woman was capable of. Because Donna had called me not out of pity but out of recognition, and recognition, when it comes from the right source, is one of the more nourishing things a person can receive. I called Patricia to tell her. She cried immediately, which made me laugh. "I'm not dying," I said. "I got a job." "I know," she said, still slightly teary. "I'm just so glad. You deserve so much, Marina. I hope you know that." "I'm starting to," I said, and meant it. I want to tell you about a moment in February, because it's the one that stays with me most. Not the meeting with the documents, not the signed agreements, not even Derek's quiet defense at Patricia's Christmas gathering. This moment was smaller, unremarkable to anyone who witnessed it, but it was the moment I knew at a cellular level that something fundamental had permanently changed in me. I was at a grocery store on a Saturday morning, doing entirely ordinary things, comparing olive oils, trying to remember if I needed cumin, being quietly annoyed at a display that was blocking half the aisle. And I ran into a woman named Cheryl, who was a peripheral family acquaintance, a friend of a cousin of Derek's. the kind of person you know just well enough to stop and exchange a few minutes of conversation with. Cheryl was warm superficially. She asked about Derek. She asked about how things were going. And then, with the particular brand of conversational landmine that some people deploy under the guise of curiosity, she said, "I heard you've had kind of a hard year. Weren't you between jobs for a while? That must have been rough." 6 months ago, I would have felt the familiar contraction, the need to minimize, to reassure, to make my difficulties smaller so the other person remained comfortable. I would have said something like, "It's been a journey," or "working through some transitions." Some smooth, self-effacing language that smoothed over the actual fact of what had happened and left Cheryl feeling fine and left me feeling like I had, once again, made myself disappear to preserve someone else's ease. Instead, I looked at Cheryl and I said, "It was hard, yes, and then I handled it. I start a new position next month." Just that. No apology for the hardship. No performance of having been fine when I wasn't. No excessive sharing either, just the true, clean shape of it. It was hard. I handled it. I'm moving forward. Cheryl blinked slightly, said, "Oh, that's wonderful." And we exchanged a few more ordinary words and then parted. I stood in the olive oil aisle for a moment after she walked away, and I felt something so unfamiliar it took me a second to identify it. I felt like myself. Not the managed version, not the careful version, not the version that carried everyone else's comfort as a personal responsibility. Just myself. 62 years old, a little tired, occasionally still angry about things I was processing, newly employed, imperfect, and entirely unwilling to apologize for any of it. That was the breakthrough, not the documents on the table, not the formal agreements, not even Derek's defended sentence at Christmas. It was a grocery store on a Saturday morning where I told a peripheral acquaintance the truth in 3 plain sentences and felt, for the first time in longer than I can calculate, completely, quietly free. My mother was wrong about one thing: carry your weight and then some. I had followed that instruction faithfully for 6 decades, and it had made me strong in certain ways. Genuinely strong, the kind of strong that comes from being tested and surviving the test, from building things in the dark and knowing they hold. I don't regret the strength. But my mother never told me the other part, the part she maybe didn't know or knew and couldn't say, that there is a difference between carrying your weight and carrying everyone else's weight as though it were also yours. That the second thing is not strength. It is the performance of strength, and it costs you in ways that don't show up for years. In the quiet exhaustion that becomes background noise, in the way you stop knowing what you actually want because you've been so busy managing what everyone else needs, in the way you sit at a dinner table while someone calls you a loser, and you fold your napkin and say nothing because you have confused dignity with silence. Silence is not dignity. I want to say that plainly because I wish someone had said it to me 20 years ago. Silence is sometimes necessary and sometimes strategic and sometimes the right call, but it is not in itself dignity. Dignity is what you maintain when you finally speak. Dignity is walking into a room with a folder of documents and setting them on the table. Dignity is telling your son that sorry is a beginning and not an end. Dignity is standing in a grocery store aisle and saying it was hard. I handled it without flinching. I had confused the two for most of my adult life, and the confusion had cost me something I was only now beginning to accurately measure. The thing I want you to understand, if you are someone who has spent years being the person who absorbs, who carries, who manages and mediates, and makes sure everyone else is comfortable while your own comfort lives somewhere at the bottom of the priority list. The thing I want you to understand is this: the people who benefit from your silence are not the people who will defend you when it matters. They will sit at the table, they will refill their wine, they will let someone else name you a burden, a failure, a woman with no future, and they will look at the tablecloth because looking at the tablecloth costs them nothing. The people who love you, the real ones, not the ones you've purchased with sacrifice and sustained with silence. Those people will show up with lemon scones and sit at your kitchen table and look you in the eye. They will sign documents when they're wrong and not try to negotiate the terms. They will defend you in passing at Christmas gatherings without expecting a trophy for it. The difference between those two kinds of people is what the last year taught me how to see clearly. By spring, things had settled into something I can only describe as a new normal, which sounds like a cliche and is, but the thing about cliches is that they often survive because they're accurate. Derek and I talked every week, sometimes about real things, sometimes about nothing. He was in therapy. He had told me this quietly in March, in the way that men of his generation tell you something vulnerable, which is sideways and briefly and then immediately subject to change of topic. I told him I was glad. He nodded and changed the topic. We were imperfectly rebuilding, one conversation at a time, one Tuesday call at a time. Vanessa and I were not close. I want to be honest about that because the version of the story where we become friends would be more satisfying and less true. What we were was civil. What we were was careful with each other in a way that had not existed before, because now we both understood the actual terrain. She knew what I knew what she was capable of. We operated within that knowledge, and that operation was not warm, but it was real. And real, I had learned, is worth more than warm that is false. There was one dinner in March at Derek and Vanessa's house, the first time I had been back since the meeting. Vanessa had cooked, actually cooked, not the performance of hosting she usually managed, but a real imperfect meal, with slightly overcooked pasta and a sauce that was good but over-salted. She had not set the table like a magazine photo. The candles were the cheap tea light kind. When I walked in and saw the table, something moved through me that I couldn't quite name. Later, I thought it was recognition, the recognition of someone trying, simply and without theatre, to do something differently. I brought wine. The good kind. I poured it myself. We ate together, the four of us. Derek, Vanessa, me, and Patricia, who had been invited and who sat beside me and talked too much about a home renovation she was planning, which was both irrelevant and exactly what the table needed. The conversation was not deep. It was not a turning point. Nobody said anything particularly honest or memorable. It was just dinner. A slightly over-salted dinner with cheap candles and good wine and people who had hurt each other and were trying, in their different imperfect ways, to be in the same room without doing it again. That's what families are when they're working. Not the version from the outside, the crystal glasses and the swan-folded napkins and the performance of having it together. The real version. Over-salted pasta and old wounds and the daily choice, renewed every morning to try again. I am not certain that family chose correctly every day. I know I didn't. Healing is not a straight line. There were weeks when Derek slipped back into the old distance and weeks when I felt the anger resurface and had to sit with it like an unwanted house guest until it got quiet enough to manage. There were conversations with Vanessa that went sideways and had to be set aside and returned to later. There were mornings when I lay in bed and felt the weight of everything that had happened and wondered, in the honest hour before coffee, whether any of it had been worth the cost. But then I would get up and I would make coffee and I would go to my new job, the one that recognized what I knew and paid me accordingly, and didn't once suggest that 62 was a liability rather than an asset. And I would do work that mattered competently on my own terms. And I would think, yes, it was worth it. Not because everything was fixed, because I was no longer pretending it wasn't broken. Because the pretending had been the thing that was killing me slowly, the way slow things kill, without drama, without a visible wound, just the gradual erosion of everything that made you recognizably yourself. I had stopped pretending. That was the achievement, not the documents, not the meeting, not the signed agreements and the legal closure and the moment. Vanessa sat in my living room with her armor off. The achievement was the stopping of the pretending, and everything else had followed from that. I still have the yellow legal pad. Most of it is filled now, with notes from Helen, with observations from the hard months, with the list I eventually made of what I actually wanted. That list is private and I will not reproduce it here except to say that it was shorter than I expected and more specific than I'd managed to be about myself in a very long time. But the last page, the one I turned to in November after Vanessa left my living room, the one with "What do I want now?" written at the top, That page has one sentence on it. Just one. I wrote it the morning I accepted the job offer from Donna in January. Before I called Patricia and made her cry. It says, I want to be known for what I actually am, not protected from what I'm not. That's it. That's the whole sentence. That's what I had been working toward in the drawer of documents and the drive through October trees and the meeting in Clover Ridge and every conversation that came after. Not revenge, not vindication, not even justice exactly, though justice had been part of it. Just the right to be seen clearly. The right to have my actual life, its costs, its sacrifices, its value, acknowledged instead of rewritten by someone who needed me to be smaller than I was. The right that every person has and that most of us spend far too long not claiming, to take up exactly the space we occupy and not apologize for the dimensions. I am Marina Cole. I am 62 years old. I have made mistakes and I will make more. I am not perfect and I am not finished. And I am not, by any reasonable measure, someone who should be defined by the worst thing someone said about me at a dinner table in October. I was called a loser once in front of people I loved by someone who did not know me. I was the foundation of the house she stood in. And I'm the woman who walked back to her car, drove 40 minutes home through burning trees, opened a drawer and got to work. That is enough. That is in fact everything.